I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before beginning this edition of the show, I want to remind you that I need your help to keep this program going. And you can do that by supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I don't have an advertiser, I don't have a sponsor at this time, so it is you, the Patreon supporters, that keep this show going, and I could really use your support. Believe it or not, I do not make that much money from this podcast, even though it is my full-time endeavor. There are YouTubers and content creators making far more than I do. I'm trying to keep my head above water as I produce this content, so if you can, please support me with a donation. Now, we've had a lot of news internationally in the past few days. There's that old saying that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen, and boy does it feel like one of those times. In the past week, we've seen the collapse of the French government, and in addition to that, the toppling of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Parallax Views will be covering both of those events. In this episode, we'll look at the collapse of the French government with friend of the show, Marlon Ettinger, and Olly Haynes, both of whom together host the podcast Flap 24, or the French Legislative Assembly Podcast 2024. We're going to be talking all about the historic moment in France. Something like this hasn't happened since 1962. There was a vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister. What does it mean? Well, we'll be talking about that in the conversation to follow. We'll also talk about French President Emmanuel Macron. And boy, is it a doozy. We'll be talking about Le Pen near the end of the show and the national rally, the far right. And we'll also be talking about the French political left embodied by Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This is an episode all about French politics, and hopefully you'll find it enlightening. With that being said, let's get right to it with Marlon Ettinger and Olly Haynes. Welcome to Parallax Views. Returning guest and friend of the show. He's been with us for a while now. He's sort of our whisperer when it comes to French politics. And also, we've covered Jeffrey Epstein with him. Marlon Ettinger. And joining him is Olly, his co-host on the Flap 24 or Flap 24 now podcast. And we're going to be talking about what in the world is going on with French politics, because Marlon just got published in the New York Times. The far right just toppled France's government, and nobody knows what happens next. December 5th, 2024. Marlon Ettinger. I was like blown away when I saw that and when Marlon told me about it. I'm happy to see that Marlon's work is getting covered. It was great opinion piece. Let's get right to it, though. What do we mean when we say that the government of France has been toppled?
Hey, JG. He always damns me with faint praise. He's always very surprised whenever I succeed at something, but I'll take it. So what that means is basically there was a no confidence vote. In the National Assembly, if a majority of deputies say we're voting against the government, the prime minister falls. The prime minister has to go. That majority is like 288 now. Normally it's 289, but there's like a couple of deputies that had to drop out and there's going to be new elections. And so 321 deputies the other day voted against the government. So the government's got to go. It was an alliance of the National Rally, that's Marine Le Pen's party, and the New Popular Front, which is this coalition of left-wing parties. And when I say alliance, I don't mean like a political alliance. It was an alliance. They both voted for Michel Barnier's government to go because Michel Barnier's government was trying to pass a budget, which maybe Olly could tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, this is essentially an austerity budget. So when Macron came to power in 2017, France's deficit was something like 2.1%. By the summer of this year, it was meant to be about 4.4%. It actually turned out to be like 6.2%. So a big increase in what was expected. Why did this happen? Well, because for the last 7 years, Macron has been passing essentially unfunded tax cuts and has overseen a kind of upwards transfer of wealth from the ordinary citizens of France to the very, very well off. And now this has all come to light. EU spending rules mean you've got to get back between certain limits. And so the government needed to find 60 billion worth of savings. The budget that they proposed included 20 billion worth of tax raises, largely amended. So some at the initiative of Michel Barnier, but others largely added by the left. And then 40 billion worth of austerity cuts, which included like 4,000 teaching posts being removed, cuts to healthcare, cuts to vital public services. And Le Pen, as well as having, her usual far-right concerns about immigration and crime, is trying to position herself as like the protector of the social state, the protector of the welfare state. So she said to Barnier he would have to remove the tax on electricity. He did that. She then said that he would have to cancel a part of the budget that would have meant that people could no longer get their prescriptions reimbursed. So he cancelled that. And then she asked him to index pensions to inflation. And he kind of wavered on that, said he wasn't going to do it, hinted eventually that he might do it, but by that point she'd committed to collapsing the government. So she joined the left in calling for the government to go and voted accordingly.
So, what does this mean for France right now in the current moment? Do you want to tackle that, Marlon? And by the way, it wasn't faint praise. It was just, wow, I've had a guest on that writes for the New York Times.
I know, I'm just giving JG the business. Yeah, so what it means for France now is there's gonna, in theory, have to be a new prime minister. The government hasn't resigned yet, though they have to resign now. And they will eventually. Macron will name a new prime minister. And will he be able to get a majority that won't vote against him? Because the left says, of course, if you name a prime minister from the right, we're going to still vote against you. And the right says, if you name a prime minister from the left, we're going to vote against you. And the right says, the left says, if you name a prime minister at all to the right, we're going to vote against you. And the far right, National Rally, says, if you name a prime minister who's not far enough to the right for us, we're going to vote against him too. So a lot of that, it's going to be hard to thread the needle for Macron, honestly, except that now the Socialist Party, which was supposed to be part of this left-wing alliance, the New Popular Front, the Socialist Party is joining in negotiations with Macron and may be ready to betray the alliance, despite the fact that they campaigned in the legislative elections over the summer as a coalition, and they said they wouldn't, back down on the program that they campaigned on, and that program included reversing the retirement reform. So Macron in 2023 raised the retirement age to 64. The left says, we're running on bringing it back down to 62. The Socialist Party, their leader's a guy named Olivier Faure right now, he's open to negotiating on that. And, on Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly podcast for 2024, which I always fastidiously plug, on one of our latest episodes, we did the vote math, and we looked at, can a government succeed if the socialists don't vote against it? And the answer is yes. If the socialists don't vote against the government, then there's only 266 votes for a no confidence measure. You need 288. So if they stay in a bloc and Macron names someone from the Socialist Party, there is a possibility they could have a Socialist Party prime minister. But, the Socialist Party is kind of like the Labour Party in England or the Democratic Party in the United States. They're not really a socialist, left-wing revolutionary party. They're like a pro-business, centrist, reform. They're going to be open to tax cuts. They're going to be open to, well, they say they're now open to the retirement age staying up, more balance the budget economics. So that's one likely possibility.
I just wanted to come in there quickly and say that this is like, although it's not surprising in the kind of scheme of things, even the quite recent scheme of things, that the Socialist Party is doing this or has said this, it is sort of not surprising, but it goes against what they have been saying for the last few months. There's a video from 3 or 4 months ago of their leader, Olivier Faure, explicitly arguing against this alliance, explicitly saying that it's just a trap to divide the NFP. And he has either changed his mind or is so worried about the possibility of an internal coup that he's deciding to break the alliance. I think it's probably that he's changed his mind, but he's kind of being pulled in two directions.
So I guess the question I have is, what does this mean for governance in France in the immediate or the present? Because I think some of my listeners have voiced confusion on that.
Yeah, so the government is still here. The ministers are going to their ministries. The prime minister is going to his prime ministry. All the civil servants are still working and getting paid. France legally needs a government, legally needs a budget, I think, by December 18th under the Constitution. And if they don't have a budget, that means, well, they need one. But it's not like America, so there's no possibility of a shutdown. There's no possibility of salaries going unpaid or anything. If it does come to the point where there isn't a budget by that deadline, the current government will essentially stay in office, or another prime minister will just govern by ordinance. So they'll continue last year's budget. What that means, which is essentially a budget cut, of course, because inflation every year. It's a de facto budget cut. But it's not like salaries will go unpaid. There's a good newspaper in France. Anybody who's looking to get into France, it's looking to get France pilled, should read Le Canard Enchaîné. It's a great, weekly paper that has a lot of the inside track on what's going on and good explanations. And they talked about how if they do start governing by ordinances, that might mean that some people who currently aren't taxed will become taxable. Basically, the people who aren't taxed include, a lot of people who are on pensions, certain classes of workers who have negotiated agreements with the government, in certain industries. But if you start governing by ordinance, I think those tax waivers are waived again. There will be people who have to be taxed, and then some people will even be taxed more. So there is that possibility in the present. But that present is in a couple of weeks. For now, Macron is just looking for a new prime minister, and all the names are swirling around, all the rumors. There's a guy named Sébastien Lecornu. He's the minister of the army. He's been a minister for the past, I think, 7 years, not in that same position, but, in the face of all the instability and all the different prime ministers, Sébastien Lecornu has stayed around. He's considered to be a real Macron loyalist. So he might be named prime minister, but then there's the idea that there might be a Socialist Party politician. There's a guy named Bernard Cazeneuve, whose name always comes up. He was François Hollande the president before Macron's prime minister, and before he was prime minister, he was interior minister. And he is a member of the sort of right-wing section of the Socialist Party. And that's what I always sort of alluded to, that there's this factional dispute in the Socialist Party. After 2022, when the Socialist Party candidate won 1.7% of the vote in the presidential election on Hidalgo, the leadership of the Socialist Party was shaken up a little bit, because that was the second election in a row when they just absolutely bombed it. In 2017, their candidate got less than 7% of the vote. And you got to remember, like, this is just in 2012, they won the presidency. They won a big majority in the National Assembly. They've been up there in power for decades, but they've completely collapsed. And, you know, they even have to like sell their headquarters in Paris. They had a famous headquarters called Solferino, which they bought back when François Mitterrand had been president for 14 years. And now they have a little headquarters in the suburbs. I think it's in Vitry-sur-Seine in the south, or Ivry. I always forget if it's Ivry, but those towns are right next to each other. And so the Socialist Party was like, okay, we're going to ally with this guy, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's the sort of most leading and dynamic force on the French left. And I may have even talked about him before on this show, JG, I forget. We've had conversations, but I forget which ones are recorded. I record all of them, for the record. No. But
Marlon's like Nixon.
Like Nixon. Yeah. I wonder if there was a French president who ever did that. I bet Mitterrand. We gotta look into that, you know, like 70s corrupt presidents. But anyway, the Socialist Party is going through this, and they said, we're going to ally with Jean-Luc Mélenchon now. So in 2022, after the presidential election, there was this alliance called NUPS. That's the acronym, stands for the New Popular Social and Ecological Union, something like that, of all these parties on the left that campaigned together in the legislative elections. And they managed to deny Macron a majority. Again, you need 289 seats for a majority. They got close, Macron's party, but not close enough. And that sort of defined French politics since 2022, because they can't pass anything without the support of other groups, which they managed to get from some right-wing groupings like the old mainstream right-wing party, Les Républicains, and even the National Rally, Le Pen's party. But they don't get to just govern the way Macron likes. And the way Macron likes to govern is his way, 100%. He sort of has this authoritarian personality.
He's very into consolidating his own power, and I wanted to get into that because I noticed yesterday, I guess it broke news that he is blaming the far left and the far right, claiming that they have worked together to destroy the government of France, to put a damper on what his agenda is. And this sort of leaves out the fact that, you know, Macron was trying to neutralize far-right opposition in the last election by siding with, you know, leftists. But then as soon as he, you know, gets everything underway and Le Pen is defeated on some level, he basically just threw those leftists under the bus. Is that correct? Is my understanding correct there?
I mean, almost. There's
Okay.
like some people sort of think that he called the elections when he did last time with a view to maybe letting the far right cohabit with him, so that there'd be a far right prime minister, and then he would govern with them in order to neutralize them before 2027. What he did not anticipate was the left getting their act together and forming a union that could contest the election in a serious way. And even in some of the triangular elections earlier this year, where the Macronist candidate is in third in a particular seat, Macron intervened personally in a couple of them to keep his candidates in the race so as to stop the left, because he disliked a particular left-wing candidate, usually from Mélenchon's party, La France Insoumise. So he has a kind of, I don't know, he's constantly playing footsie with the far right, even where he seeks to defeat them sometimes at the ballot box. We've covered a lot on Flap, these secret meetings that were leaked between Macronist ministers and Marine Le Pen and members of her party. They were having dinner at like late at night, brokered by one of Macron's closest advisors with some of Macron's close allies. So although he does try and block out the far right and like anti-fascism is the main way that he gets elected, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and he is always trying to exclude the left politically while relying on their votes to get into power, and is kind of playing with the far right at the same time.
Do you want to add to that at all, Marlon?
Yeah, I think Macron, the number one thing people need to understand about Macron is that he is not really like a left liberal in any sense. He's sort of liberal, market liberal in like the European sense. He's for the free market, etc., privatization. But he's not like a guy. He's not like his reputation, outside of France. He comes from very conservative political circles. He came to power in these networks of French conservatism, particularly around the President Nicolas Sarkozy, through his wife, Brigitte Macron, who was part of, a provincial merchant family, you could say. Her family was involved in commerce, and she had, these associations with people in conservative politics, and she was important in bringing him up and, introducing him to the right people. And so he came up in these networks around Nicolas Sarkozy, the former right-wing president of France, at the time in 2012 when he was elected, a very shockingly right-wing president, So Macron is not really a guy, I think, who judges whether he succeeded or failed and whether or not the right wing or the far right wing is stifled in the crib. They're a useful foil to him, like Olly says, because they help him get elected in the 2-round system in French politics. In French politics, the top 2 candidates in elections go into a runoff. And if he thinks he can get Marine Le Pen against him, he knows a lot of people on the left will vote for him, if only to beat Marine Le Pen and keep the fascists out of office. But as at the same time, he's perfectly happy for the ideas of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally to be integrated into his government. His ministers in the current government, Michel Barnier's, I guess it's still the current government, we can say, but his interior minister is a guy called Bruno Retailleau, who's a longtime senator for the Les Républicains party, the mainstream traditional right-wing party, and he's a classic hardliner. He's posting photos of himself on Twitter with a German shepherd looking down at the camera lens. He's saying that we need to get rid of these Français des papiers, these paper French people, referring to people who are only French by documents, not by blood, which is a term from Vichy France. That's where that term comes from. He's sitting for interviews with Valeurs Actuelles, which is the fascist weekly news magazine. And Macron has sat for interviews with him too. And his former interior minister, Gerald Darmanin, as well. We say Bruno Retailleau is very right-wing, and he's right-wing in the sense that even the National Rally was very happy about him. But the previous interior minister, Gerald Darmanin, a couple of years ago, he debated with Le Pen and basically accused Le Pen of being too soft on immigration, too soft on Islam, and said, me, Gerald Darmanin, in the Macron government is the real hardliner on immigration and on Islam. So that's how the National Rally works for him. They're the great, perfect foil for him come election time, but he'll gladly mainstream and take up all the language and ideology of the National Rally and even put it not just for rhetorical use, but put it into effect in terms of policy. He passed a bill last year, an immigration bill, which Marine Le Pen called a great ideological victory for our party. But of course, it wasn't her party and their party voted for it, but it wasn't her party who wrote the bill. It wasn't her party who shepherded it through the National Assembly. It was Macron and his party.
What do you make of his blaming? He keeps saying it's an alliance of the extreme right and the extreme left that has caused this. I find that rich coming from Macron, to be honest. And, I think the left is in France is fair to say, we've had enough and you threw us under the bus for the last time. At least from my ignorant Yank perspective, that's my understanding of what he did. So.
Yeah, I mean, well, the left has voted for a no confidence measure before. The only difference, the reason why this one has succeeded is because the National Rally has joined with them, It's not as if the left is voting against Macron's government because they agree. If anything, you can say, well, the National Rally is now voting against Macron's government because they agree with the left. but that would, and I think Marine Le Pen wants to sort of promote that idea a little. So she's seen, as always said, like this defender of social values. But I think it's a little ridiculous. But it's because, and I think the left and the right and the far left and the far right in France are not in agreement on anything. And,
Right.
Marine Le Pen says she'll censor any government with even a left-wing minister. She'll censor any government with even a minister in the Socialist Party in it, because the Socialist Party are de facto in alliance with LFE, La France Insoumise. The far right is even calling this budget a socialist budget, because they say there's all these public spending, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, of course, the left is calling it the opposite. It's an austerity budget. And I don't think it's not a matter of debate. I mean, it is an austerity budget. That's the factual truth of the budget. So, Macron, I always lose my train of thought.
Well, I was just getting it. It just strikes me as whining by him, in the sense of
Oh,
he kicks around the left and then is mad when they, say, well, screw you.
yeah. Well, I think
Yeah,
it's part of this strategy. I'll just finish up. Sorry, Ollie, because I thought of what I was going to say. But um, he has this idea that he portrays political forces that are not useful to him or that are an inconvenience to him as being outside of the arc of the republic, that there's a Republic of France and there are certain values that the Republic of France holds, and parties that hold values or political ideas outside of that should be excluded, really, from political life. And so he says that La France Insoumise and their ideas of, defending Palestine against a genocide, that's outside of the arc of public life, because now Mélenchon is anti-Semitic because
Yeah, I think he's used
they,
the term anti-Republican front. Yeah, but go on.
yeah, and
But
so he says
about
that,
Mélenchon, you were saying he calls him anti-Semitic, or
yeah, he does, and then the whole movement, La France Insoumise, they basically exclude any idea that they can be involved in government at all, even though they were elected as part of a coalition that won not the majority but a plurality of seats. It's out of the question that they can have any involvement in the government, because he says they're anti-Semitic. He says they're outside of the Republican front. They make the public debate violent. They have they raise Palestinian flags in the National Assembly. They get into verbal altercations. And so he's doing sort of the same thing to the National Rally. They've always tried to do the same to the National Rally, at least now when he's trying to blame them when he suffered a defeat. At other times, his government and him are very open to the National Rally and don't exclude them. I think they exclude LFE more definitively from the Republican arc in this sense. But now that he's suffered a setback at the hands of the National Rally and the LFE, he's going to say, oh, look, it's not even saying, oh, it's funny, because it's not even saying, oh, look, LFE is like the National Rally. He goes, oh, look, the National Rally is just like LFE, you know?
yeah, and in terms of whining, it is just whining. Like the like locus, the cause of all of this instability, because that's really what he sort of claims he hates, is the idea of instability and institutional breakdown is what he when he speaks claims is like the main problem. He is the cause of it all.
well,
But
that's what
he is
I
like,
would, not to interrupt you, Ollie, but that's what I was going to say. I keep hearing him talk about, this is all the fault of the coalition of the irresponsible and just all these buzzwords, and it's like there's no reason why his government failed. There's no self-reflection on his part, it feels like.
yeah, at this point he almost seems like solipsistic. Like he called an election that he didn't need to call, lost, and has been completely unable to get over that fact. And now, anytime anything happens that goes against his will, he just sort of screams about how everyone's irresponsible. If you were to take the same line that he takes about not wanting to cause institutional instability and chaos and political chaos, um, you would say, why did you even call that election? It was fairly obvious you were not going to do that well. Even if the left hadn't got his act together, it did not look like he was going to do very well. So he is just completely whining. And then, like, on the point of sort of comparing La France Insoumise to Marine Le Pen, he tried to invite them to the assembly recently, apparently, but knowing that La France Insoumise would not accept the offer. But it's far too much, like far too little, too late. It's completely beyond the point that anyone could deal with him. Because why would you try and deal with this guy that has governed on the right for the last 7 years and has spent the last 7 years like spitting on the Français and their voters? You can't do that and then expect them to come and bail you out, basically, which is what he's asking them to do.
I was going to say that the motion for this no confidence vote, it was well above the required number of deputies, wasn't it? It was, I think it was 331 deputies supported the motion. So, I mean, to me, this is Macron's, it's on his shoulders ultimately.
Yeah, I think, 331. I think that's right. Well beyond the 288.
289 is the required, yeah.
It's actually 288. We had this discussion
Okay.
on Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly.
My apologies. I'm the ignorant Yankee
No,
here.
you're wrong. You're not. No, I mean, you're right. Is what I meant to say. You're right. It normally is 289, but because there've been 2 deputies that had to resign for various reasons, it changes what a majority is. So it's technically 288 now. And you can get more of that parliamentary inside baseball on Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly podcast for 2024, which is available on all your podcatchers.
And you are uh, you are right to like pin this specifically on Macron, because although this was like a vote of no confidence in Michel Barnier, and this was brought about by Barnier's budget, and all of that is true. Everyone knows that the Prime Minister in the Fifth Republic generally, but under Macron in particular, is just the kind of like sock puppet of the president. The president has their hand up their ass, and this was aimed at Macron. Even though Barnier is the target of the sanction, this is aimed at Macron and other parties. La France Insoumise most vociferously, because they've actually attempted to pursue impeachment measures. Other parties have just sort of hinted that they would support it and then gone back. But the idea of impeaching Macron is becoming a little bit more part of the discourse of daily political life, because everybody hates him and he is to blame for this situation.
And he has said, he is like, I will not resign. I will not. So he is going to, I guess, try to hang in there. But maybe we could talk a little bit about, this is really unprecedented. I don't think anything like this has happened since 1962. I don't know if you want to speak about that, Marlon, or if you think Ollie should speak about that. Just the unprecedented nature of this
Yeah,
event.
the last time it happened was George Pompidou and the Fifth Republic, under this Constitution of the Fifth Republic, which was written and put into effect by de Gaulle after his coup d'état back in the day. It's never, and there's been a bunch of censor votes actually over the past couple of years, because LFI and the left have pursued this against Macron. They say it's this drum they've been beating. He doesn't have a majority. He doesn't have any legitimacy, particularly since this new election, where you could say he ignored the results of the election and appointed people who, Michel Barnier comes from a party that got 5% of the vote in the elections, which tells you everything there. It is unprecedented, and I think that's why so many people want Macron to go. There's over 62% of French people, there was an opinion poll ahead of the no confidence vote, that said they wanted Macron to resign if the no confidence vote succeeded. And like Ali mentioned, La France Insoumise has tried to impeach him. It's got stopped at some procedural points because they're the only ones who voted for them. Not even the rest of the left would end up voting for it, though they did pass it out of commission for the inside parliamentary baseball people. It got through the first couple of steps. But even now, a majority of National Rally voters, I think, according to opinion polling, say they want Macron to be impeached. So it's going to be interesting, because at the last no confidence vote, the National Rally didn't vote for it. And so it didn't pass, though the left voted for it. If the National Rally starts joining in on these impeachment votes, it can progress a lot further. Now, it's not going to progress past the Senate, because it needs to get through both the National Assembly and the Senate. And the Senate in France is controlled by this mainstream party, Republican Party, Les Républicains. And that's because it's not elected by universal suffrage. It's like the old U.S. Senate. It's elected by local electors, So it's basically, skewed towards sort of the establishment parties. LFI has no senators in the Senate, I don't think. Neither does the RN. So the impeachment would be nearly impossible to get through
And
institutionally.
and in terms of the unprecedentedness of the situation, yeah, as Marlon said, the last time it happened was in 1962 with Pompidou. But the thing that even marks this as like a break from then, like this isn't just like a sort of repeat of that moment, because De Gaulle, the reason that Pompidou had a vote of no confidence in him was because De Gaulle had proposed a measure that would have made the National Assembly directly electable via universal suffrage rather than by an electoral college. And then all of the MPs felt kind of snubbed by this, voted against De Gaulle. So to try and put pressure on him not to have this referendum to elect the National Assembly directly. In the end, government fell. De Gaulle dissolved the parliament. He did what Macron did earlier this year, and now cannot do for another year. De Gaulle won the elections. He put Pompidou back in as PM, and his referendum passed. What's completely different now is that Macron is being vote of no confidence in a situation in which he is incredibly unpopular, in which yes, he has sort of all the tricks of the Fifth Republic, which is a very undemocratic system, put in by De Gaulle via military coup at his disposal, but he does not have the will of the people on his side in any meaningful sense.
How much has Macron and figures like Barnier, how much have they conceded to the far right, Le Pen, the National Rally, which that used to be the National Front, correct? How much have they
That's right.
already conceded, and is that worth commenting on at this point?
Yeah, I mean the national rallies politics and ideology and rhetoric is mainstream in France. And that's not just because of the government, it's also because of the media, how the media has shifted heavily to the right in France. That includes, cable news channels like C News, which is owned by a billionaire, Vincent Bolloré, who's a Catholic hyper reactionary who supports politicians like the Le Pen and boosts other politicians like Eric Zemmour, who I wrote a book about, who campaigns on mass deportation, essentially. That's the most watched cable news channel in the country. And then there's even previously non-far right media, which has been taken over. Well, the Journal de Dimanche, which is a Sunday paper, which is forever been known as sort of the paper of the government, sort of a government stenographer paper. It's not owned by the government, but you read the JDD if you want to know what the government is thinking. They got bought by Bolloré, and a whole new editorial staff was put in. I mentioned that magazine Valeur Actuelle, long time known as like a fascist rag, and former editor of Valeur Actuelle now is the editor of the JDD. And Bruno Retailleau, who was the interior minister, he used to be the part of this, like it's like an amusement park slash tourist exhibition in the Vendée. It's called Puy de Fou, which basically what that is, it's this big interactive show showing the history of France, but from sort of like a reactionary conservative perspective, where the French Revolution, was not a good thing. Bruno Retailleau used to be involved in running that park. And of course, Bruno Retailleau is now in a government by a prime minister appointed by Macron. And even Macron himself, he consistently talks about the same themes that Marine Le Pen talks about in terms of immigration and welfare mooching and, need for budget
In some ways,
cuts.
he tries to outright Le Pen on certain issues. Yeah.
Definitely. And he sort of also tries to maintain his reputation as a good European liberal, but he has his ministers like these guys like Gerald Darmanin and Bruno Retailleau, which he completely tolerates and supports and stands behind 100%. Even, he hasn't said this openly, but there's an excellent investigative journalist in France named Mark Endewald. I have an interview with him in Jacobin, which people could check out because he really knows what's going on around Macron, has great sources. Um, and Macron, apparently, when Zemmour was running, he found that Macron talks about the great replacement theory all the time. He believes in it. He says that it's a bad thing and it needs to be stopped. And that's like a preoccupation of his,
So
of
you
Macron's.
don't. I'm assuming there are people in the U.S. that think, oh, Macron just has to make himself sound like he's tough on these immigration issues or Islam to beat Le Pen. I think what you're saying is no, that's not really the case. He's actually just given ground to the far right in a lot of ways.
And he's happy to.
I mean, some might say, Marlon, that to be a good European liberal now, given the state of European liberalism, is to be a brutal immigration restrictionist, is to try and drown migrants in the sea via the kind of Frontex border regime. Seems to be what all of these people do, and Macron is not much different in that regard. And yeah, he has ceded a lot of ground, like not just on immigration, but on crime. During the Gilets jaunes, there was a kind of informal, although it may turn out later via like declassified documents, or someone may break ranks and explain that it was a formal kind of alliance between Macronism and Macron and the police unions. During the Gilets jaunes, a huge amount of violence was unleashed against the protesters. And in March of 2019, he appointed this guy, Didier Lallement, as the head of the Paris police. Didier Lallement was appointed specifically because he had experience in repressing the Gilets jaunes protests in Bordeaux and was known to use kind of like sort of extra legal methods and violence to do so. He also talks up this idea of decivilization and a crisis of civilization, which relates directly to Marlon's point about possibly reading The Great Replacement and agreeing with it, because Decivilization is the title of the second book in the series of The Great Replacement by the author of the theory. And he talks about decivilization openly. And there has been kind of no punishment for police. They use the word bavure, which means like blunder, but in general, it means like very violent attack against a protester or a civilian. No punishments for people who've done that. In fact, the Macronists go out of their way to be the ones seen to be defending the police when they commit acts of quite egregious violence, some of which are like comparable to what goes on in the US.
And to go back to what you were saying earlier, how important is it to note the nature of Barnier's budget? Because I mean, it was austerity all the way, and I think that plays a big role in all of this.
Yeah, I'm writing an article about this right now for Jacobin, which I need to finish. But a big, like, underappreciated fact of France's, fiscal hole is not just the suppression of taxes that fund the national budget, but the suppression of taxes that fund the local budgets. So basically, all of them have been taken away. Local authorities have very little power of taxation now because housing tax has been phased out entirely. There used to be a tax on businesses that local authorities could levy, the CAVF. I forget what it stands for, but it was on businesses, and that's gone too. And the result is there's this huge hole in local budgets. And what Macron is doing, has been doing to fill the hole, is using money from the value-added tax. The value-added tax, on every purchase you make, everyone pays value-added tax. They call it TVA in French. So the TVA money, which previously would go to the national budget, is now going to the local budgets to cover the hole that's left by all the other taxes being suppressed. So, but it doesn't cover it entirely. So all the local authorities are close to going bankrupt. And meanwhile, the national budget has a huge hole in it. And they say, oh, we have this huge deficit, so we need to make more cuts. It's like completely, in my opinion, premeditated. It's not like they didn't know this was going to happen because of it. They knew that this crisis was going to be created. The books weren't going to balance and they'd have to cut or they'd have to raise taxes. And of course, because these governments are never going to really raise taxes. They've raised taxes a little on some things in this recent budget, citing, the urgency of France's situation. They're facing a 6%, I think, debt to GDP ratio, which is twice what the European Union allows. They allow 3% only. completely arbitrary number, by the way, but that's the rules of fiscal discipline in the European Union to be a good European liberal, and also to avoid a budget proceeding, which has been unleashed recently by the European Union. They're investigating France for not respecting budget rules, so they're justifying these extraordinary measures and proposing all these cuts. I remember when this first came out a couple months ago that there was this big hole in the budget. They were saying 15 billion euros worth of cuts. I think we covered that on Flap 24, Ollie. I remember reading those numbers, but of course it's ballooned to 40 billion since then. And I remember reading an article in Les Echos, which is a business paper, and some private consultancies were even saying sotto voce, we need 100 billion euros of cuts to possibly get this under control. And 100 billion euros worth of cuts is a huge, it's a huge amount of cuts to the budget. It's going to just gut social services, which the current budget already does with just 40 billion euros worth of cuts.
And it's worth saying that, I mean, I would agree with Marlon that this is basically a strategy of class warfare, but also in terms of the stated aims of Macronism, his economic guru, Jean Pisani-Ferry, gave an interview to a newspaper earlier this year in which he said that the theory behind their economics of tax cuts was essentially like the Laffer curve. It was, if they cut taxes, more economic activity will be generated, and then they will increase the tax yield overall. So on their stated aims, they have completely failed, and that's why France is now in this situation. Although, again, it's also worth saying, the left doesn't think the austerity is necessary. They argue for a Keynesian relaunch of the economy and restoring the taxes on big business and the rich that have led to this crisis in the first place. Obviously, Macron's never going to do that because he's bankrupt by billionaires and loves the company of billionaires. But it's not like a case of there is no alternative.
So I know there's been a number of politicians in France, established politicians, calling for Macron to resign, but this seems like it's felt at the basic level of the public in France as well. I mean, Macron is no stranger to having, um, members of the public protest against him. I think last year there was a bit of unrest over his decision to increase the retirement age. There's been a lot of turbulence even before this. Can you speak to how the public is feeling?
I can speak a little, though I will say that our podcast is more like on what's going on in the parliament, So, and that's sort of more of the reporting I do. I don't talk as much to
Yeah, but you're in
people.
France. You know what you have your finger on the pulse.
Oh, I do, and that's why I'm just setting up a story. I was out at Notre Dame today. They're reopening it. My goal was to try to get in and ask Donald Trump some questions about Jean-Luc Brunel, but I didn't end up being able to get in. But I met this journalist named Luke who does a lot of audio-visual journalism, shooting B-roll at protests and everything. And so he's always has his finger on the pulse of what protests are coming up, what to cover, what protests might be big. And, he says he's always looking for sort of the sleeper ones that not every journalist is going to be at. And I asked him, so do you think there's going to be, many more protests now with this, the censure movement and Macron refusing to step down? And he says, honestly, no, people are sort of resigned to it. People are exhausted. You had the big protest against the retirement forum in 2023. Huge. I was in France during them. There's, smoke clouding the skies, fires in the streets, charges of police and protesters and bricks thrown, and, day after day after day after day. And of course, they didn't succeed. Macron pushed through the retirement reform. They passed it undemocratically. They used a provision of the Constitution called 49.3, which refers to a section of the Constitution that lets them pass bills without a vote. These things were passed without a vote. So even though there was this huge movement in the streets, it didn't translate into anything because Macron just bypassed the National Assembly. Before that, Olly has, in this episode has talked about, and he's done a lot of reporting on the Gilets jaunes. they got what they wanted to a, they got the stated, the fuel tax that sparked that was rolled back, but any of the broader demands, nothing, no real movement. So Macron, the 7 years that Macron is it 7 or 8 now, actually? 2017. Yeah, so coming up on 8 years that he's been in power. There's been tons of social movements and protests, and Macron just doesn't respond to them. And I think his supporters, that's what they like about him. He said he's willing to do things that are unpopular. He's willing to follow through on these unpopular but necessary, they'll say, reforms. But people in the streets, and France has the great tradition of the streets, they get the message that we're not going to accomplish. He's not going to move like other governments, and because other governments might move because deputies want to make sure they're reelected, but when he's just bypassing the deputies in the National Assembly, well, what can you do? He can't run for another term next year. He can govern by decree.
Yeah, there's also he's like kind of established a disincentive to protest as well through the violence that people face, because as Marlon says, if you're pretty sure that he's not going to do anything, well, you might come out anyway, fight the good fight, stage display of resistance for the sake of it. And I kind of thought that might happen this time. I wrote in a piece that I thought that if the budget was passed by 49.3, that there would be a bit of that, but there hasn't been. And I think that partly that's because if you know that you're staging resistance, there's an element at which it can be important to stage it anyway, just to register something. But over the last few years, environmental protesters have been put into comas. Gilets jaunes have lost their hands or have been blinded. During the pension reform, there was just an absolute wave after wave after wave of mass arrests, and people would spend sort of 24, 48 hours in prison to be released with no crime, no charge, but having had their data scraped. And in the major cities now, there is kind of a disincentive to protest because, especially if you're sure that it won't do anything, why would you bother facing down the walls of robocops?
Even deputies have been arrested in these protests. Deputies, in theory, have immunity. Deputies of the French Republic, and a lot of these left-wing deputies have, tried to go into protests to exercise that and, say, oh, you can't use these tactics against us. There's a deputy here, but they'll be, roughed up and arrested and held for a little bit.
It's really interesting because you mentioned earlier the sort of authoritarian streak in Macron. Hasn't he referred to himself as wanting to be like a Jupiterian leader? I mean, I guess Jupiter is falling out of orbit, though. I don't know if you want to comment any more on that, because it does seem like even in the references to Jupiter, he kind of is saying, well, he wants to be unchallenged and detached from the trivialities. What I want goes, essentially. Although he's finding that's not really how it works, it seems like.
In the biography of him, it's a very fawning biography written by the economist journalist Sophie Pedder. So she spins this in the most kind of sympathetic way possible. But she talks about how his understanding of French politics is that the president is elected and they are the incarnation of the people's will, and Macron doesn't like politics, and by which she means the kind of doing of deals, the managing of coalitions, the balancing of interests. He understands, as far as she's concerned, and she makes this seem like a good thing. He understands that he's been elected. He has the mandate of heaven. He has the people's will, and therefore he can do what he wants.
He's the supreme authority.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've talked a bunch with this guy, Jean-Bernard Guy-Renucci, who's a former Macron advisor. He worked on his 2017 campaign, and he was the guy in charge of the right for Macron, because he sort of comes from a center-right background, worked with Chirac and stuff. And he said the same thing to me. He said, he'd be in these headquarters and with all these young guys working on Macron's campaigns, and politics was a dirty word in the campaign headquarters. The idea that you have to appeal to people or make alliances or work with the National Assembly at all, because he didn't have to work with the National Assembly in his first term. He had a huge majority. So he could just, whatever he went would go, is foreign to Macron. And he said in that sense, like, aside from what Macron thinks politically, he's not a moderate or a centrist, because a centrist tries to build a coalition. A centrist tries to get guys from the right and the left to, the ideal form of a centrist, the best ideas of the right, the best ideas of the left, and pass things that people can agree on. But that's not what Macron does. Like you said, supreme authority. There's the famous interview with him before the 2017 presidential election where he says basically, the French people have always sort of regretted killing the monarch, and they wish there still was a monarch, and there still is sort of the vision or the image of a monarch in the president of the republic, and he fulfills that role. It's the void, right, that he says, Ollie, that the French people want filled.
In terms,
And Macron sure is a void.
well, this seems like a classic case of hubris coming back to haunt a leader. So before we start wrapping up, your New York Times op-ed ends with you saying, as for Miss Le Pen and her allies, they are clearly no longer content just to push French political life to the right. Now they want power. It might not be too long before they get it. Let's delve into that. Where do you think Le Pen goes from here in her faction within French political life?
For her personally, it depends on the outcome of this court case. But I think even if she gets, convicted or whatever, there's plenty of other people in the party. Their party has 121 deputies in the National Assembly. They're the biggest single group. 121 deputies, the National Rally. In 2017, how many did they have, Ollie? Like 2? Is that right?
Yeah,
like 2, right?
Yeah, and then the far right in 2022 they got a few more, and then this was the big surge.
They've broken through, they've really broken through, and like we talked about, all their ideas being mainstream. A lot of people seem to want to give them a chance. There was all this reporting before the legislative elections when there was this expectation that they would win an outright majority of senior civil servants in the government getting ready to say, okay, let's give the National Rally a chance to govern. I wrote an article about it for Jacobin. There's this group of anonymous senior civil servants called the Horaces, who for years have been meeting with Le Pen and sort of writing her programs and getting ready to govern with her. And right before the latest election, which it was upended by the performance of the left, but a lot of these Horaces started coming out into the open by name because they were expecting to soon be named to positions in government. There's a guy, Pierre-Edouard Stéphane, another Catholic billionaire who lives in Brussels to avoid taxes. He's all in on the National Rally. There's of course, Bolloré. There's all these people who are very close to Le Pen in government, ready to give them a chance. And so I think the electoral trend, unless the left pulls it together, is it's inevitable. The National Rally is going to come to power at some point. At the time of the elections, I was living in Lille. I'm outside of Paris now. But there was in the department, which is called Nord and Pas-de-Calais, there's these 2 departments. In Pas-de-Calais, I think all but 2 of their candidates won in the first round. There were 14 constituencies, 12 of them won in the first round, which means they got over 50% of the vote in the first round. There's places in France where the National Rally is just uncontested, They win and they will continue winning. And when they continue winning, they're going to establish their local political fiefs. In Perpignan, a city to the south near Spain, they've been in power since the last municipal elections. I think actually the municipal elections before at this point, almost 10 years in local government. It's just a matter of time before they take national power, because outside, I think, of a certain section of the left, not even the whole left, La France Insoumise, there's not a lot of opposition to the premises of the National Rally. They'll just dispute, how we solve it, or how harsh we should be. They don't reject the racism of the National Rally. Macron and the mainstream, they don't reject the fiscal ideas, the idea that France is, so heavily indebted and needs huge budget cuts. etc. They don't reject any of it. So it's just going to happen eventually. And as to like, practical short term, there could be legislative elections next year. That's the closest time that the Constitution allows it. And if there's continuing gridlock, it seems inevitable that there'll be elections. So maybe Macron just wants to write it out. Who knows? If not, 2027. Opinion polling. I've heard from some people, I don't know if these have been released yet, but the opinion polls are showing a Marine Le Pen versus Mélenchon runoff, which is kind of interesting.
Can I make the counter argument? Not that I necessarily think Marlon is wrong, but I can pose the sort of the, like the way in which this could go wrong for the National Rally. The first is that the left does better than expected. La France Insoumise is testing a hypothesis that they call the fourth bloc, which is that it's been pretty well theorized at this point that there are three political blocs in French society: a national sovereignist far-right bloc, a bourgeois bloc in the middle, combined of liberals and sort of conservatives who vote for Macron, and then a left bloc, which aligned itself all together in the NFP and came first. They're all roughly equivalent size. La France Insoumise's theory is that there are enough abstentionists, because the abstention rate is really high, the left could charge to victory off the back of activating loads of these abstentionists. This is how the left has been growing. And also there is lots of polling and sociological data to show that the interests and ideology of the non-voters are most closely aligned with the voters of the left compared to the voters of the other two blocs. Certainly they're not aligned with the bourgeois bloc of Macronists, but also the data seems to suggest that they are closer in profile to the voters of the left. So if La France Insoumise were to test this theory at the next election and it worked out, that's one way in which it could go wrong for Le Pen, is a massive sway activation of abstentionists to carry the left to power. I think that's unlikely, but that is the kind of theory that they're operating on. The other way in which this could go wrong for Le Pen is, as Marlon says, the outcome of this trial. If Le Pen is found guilty and given a non-eligibility penalty, meaning that she can't run for 5 years or so, that could fracture the rights coalition, because then the knives will be out for who succeeds her. There's not an obvious inheritor necessarily. Some people think it could be Jordan Bardella, but her niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, has returned to the fold and has created this kind of new formation recently, which is called Identity and Liberty, I think, which is like very obviously designed to try and create a sort of power base for her and her fusion of Marine Le Pen's ideas and Eric Zemmour's ideas, and be a springboard for her own career. So you could see, hypothetically, Le Pen get a non-eligibility penalty through the courts, and then a sort of cool civil war amongst the younger generation of the RN might spill out into the open and fracture the right once more. Because it is only at the last election, really, that the right fully unified. There was the Zemmour camp, who were often a hook on Kit, and there was the Republicans, who had a far-right leader at that time. They all came together into the RN coalition effectively at the last election. And I don't know if that coalition has been held together long enough that it is guaranteed that it will always hold. But then power, the prospect of power does tend to dissolve people's differences. So who knows? But that's just to make the counter arguments to Marlon.
I would even add, I see a possibility of Mélenchon winning a Mélenchon-Le Pen runoff.
I wanted you to talk about that. That's the next thing I was going to ask. What does this mean for the left? But
yeah, even like I think if that runoff did happen, you'd see, like Olly said, the right would actually all unite behind Le Pen. I think the idea that used to exist in French politics, where everyone would vote against the National Rally, has dissolved. People will still vote against the National Rally if they disagree with them, but there's no idea of this Republican front where everyone has to exclude the National Rally for power and prevent them from taking power. That's gone. The right will vote for Le Pen, and a lot of the establishment and the media will even support Le Pen, and particularly point out the alleged danger of someone like Mélenchon coming to power. So he would face that. But here's my bullish case for the left and Mélenchon. Mélenchon's a great politician, and he's a great speaker. People like him when they talk to him. when he talks to them. He's done better in every single election that he's been in. He's, organized the party even stronger every time. Some might say through purges or through, don't have time to get into that, but it's like the campaigning force he has is like the tip of a spear, and it's, cured and it's been forged and strengthened. And obviously this would be the last time he could run. He'll be almost 75 in 2027. And that would mean something to him. He wants to be elected. He has this personal ambition, which is undeniable, and I think probably important to win president, to have insane fixation on personally wanting to take power. And so I do think he could win, but it's going to be tough. And I think, unfortunately, after Mélenchon goes, the left is going to fracture again. He's the only thing it's barely being held together now. But the force of his personality is, I think, a big reason why the left is, these coalitions have been formed on the left and are staying together to any degree. He sort of imposes order, and his critics would say that's a symptom of his authoritarian personality and the lack of democracy or commitment to his democracy. But whatever the reason is, it's the result.
So can I ask you one completely off-topic question that I may cut or may not on a lighter note?
Sure.
What did you guys hear about the craziness with Marine Le Pen's equally controversial 96-year-old father singing along with a skinhead group recently?
Yeah, we covered that on Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly.
I wanted to ask you about this because I saw Marine Le Pen was saying, "Oh, they're taking advantage of my father. He doesn't even know what year it is." And I'm like, I don't know about that.
Well, that's really funny because not 1 week before he claimed mental incapacity to not be able to appear in court, and yet there he is singing whatever it was, like a Nazi song with a Nazi metal band. So Marine Le Pen was at least being consistent that he was mentally incapable, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the line. The doctors say he can't stand trial because of mental incapacity. The word is that he... Okay, so here's the thing. What the doctors actually said is that he doesn't have the capability to focus for more than an hour at a time, and that's why he can't stand trial. It's not that he's completely lost his mind. It's that he tires easily, and it would be wrong to put an old person like that through a trial like that. So it's not like he's lost his mind. He's lucid at times. He's just old and tired. So I think
karaoke doesn't take an hour.
Exactly. The song's what, 5 minutes? But I don't know, some of those German marching songs, they go on for a long time. But I think he knew what he was doing because that's what he believes.
Well, we'll leave it at that. And I want to thank you again, Marlon and Olly, for coming on Parallax Views. Take it away with how my listeners can listen to the podcast.
Yeah, we might not have mentioned it, but it's called Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly podcast for 2024. It used to be called Flap 24, the French Legislative Assembly podcast for 2024. You can listen to it, all podcatchers, Apple, Spotify, Podbean, I think, anyone you can think of. If you can't find it on the podcatcher you listen to, email us at flap24pod@gmail.com and we'll get it on for you. And if you want to support the show, we take money for newspaper subscriptions at buymeacoffee.com/flap24. And we might be doing some more deep dives. We usually just do news hits. We'd love to do some more deep dives into some topics. So we set up a Patreon, patreon.com/flap24. My Twitter is Marlon Ettinger. Olly?
Mine is reality_manager. It's an annoying name, I know. I'm sorry.
And then there's Flap24 Pod on Twitter as well, where you can follow all your Flap24 news from.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. Hope you enjoyed the conversation with Marlon Ettinger and Olly Haynes of the Flap 24 podcast. As always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views.
to with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.